Hello, Longhorns, and welcome to the April Lunchtime Lecture. I'm Chuck Harris, Executive Director of the Texas Exes. We've got a fascinating lesson today, but first off, I want to thank all of those of you who donated when you registered. Those funds are critical to the work we do and help us provide programming like this for all of our lifetime learners out there. The title of today's lecture is Why Holocaust and Genocide Studies, a Historian's Perspective. Dr. Tatjana Lichtenstein is an associate professor in UT's Department of History and the director of the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies. Her research focuses on minorities, nationalism, state building, war, and genocide in Eastern Europe in the 20th century. She teaches classes on the Holocaust and the world wars in Eastern Europe. In these courses, she introduces students to the broad ideological and political background for the wars, to ordinary people's wartime experiences, and to the legacies of mass violence in European societies. Dr. Lichtenstein has been part of the Frank Denius Normandy Scholars Program on World War II since 2014. Professor, thanks so much for being here today. The class is all yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me, Texas Exes, to give this talk. Thank you to the staff as well at Texas Exes, and especially to LAITS for all your amazing help. Also, thank you all out there in the audience for making time to attend this talk. I've had the privilege of teaching here at UT for more than 10 years. During that time, I've developed a series of courses on war and genocide, primarily on the Second World War and the Holocaust, and that area has also become the topic of my research. Most fall semesters, I teach a large survey on the Holocaust, and it attracts students from across campus. This past fall, the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies, for which I serve as director, launched a new degree program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. This minor is designed to provide students with a broad scholarly background, which will help them to understand the historical, political, social, psychological, and cultural context for genocide as a global phenomenon. Students take one required introductory course and then 4 other courses on some aspect of genocide approached from a variety of disciplines. They analyze genocide either comparatively or as part of the study of a particular country or a particular region. In my years teaching and researching this topic, I've been asked many times why I've decided to study such an unpleasant history. Aside from the fact that as a professional historian, I find this particular history fascinating and ceaselessly challenging, I believe that the study of genocide serves several important purposes for students and indeed for the general public. And these are some of the reflections that I'd like to share with you today. Let's begin in my classroom. At the start of every semester, as we settle into our first class together, I open the floor to students to share with each other and with the class why they've chosen to enroll in a course on genocide. First, almost all students know what the Holocaust is. Very few know examples of other genocides. It is not surprising, given how prominent the Holocaust has been in education and popular culture the last 30 years. Many students have encountered the Holocaust in school through books, Elie Wiesel's Night, or for younger readers, Lois Lowry's Number of the Stars. A few has also seen films such as Schindler's List or The Pianist, although I'm sorry to say that those films are considered ancient by now, and Inglourious Basterds or The Boy in the Striped Pajamas are most students' movie introduction to the subject. Students also share with some discomfort that they chose the class because they find the topic fascinating and are curious to learn more. They often state, as they have no doubt been taught, that genocide is an important topic that we must learn about, so quote, it never happens again. Thus, some students anticipate that learning about genocide will make them better prepared to guard and intervene against abuse, discrimination, and racism. Again, this is a product of the many programs that use the Holocaust for lessons about bullying, individual responsibility to speak up, and tolerance. I'm not going to quibble with these programs and organizations here today. What I will say, as a historian of the Holocaust and as a student of genocide more generally, is that there is little in the scholarly research that can underpin or provide evidence for any of the lessons often ascribed to the study of the Holocaust and genocide. As the Holocaust historian Doris Bergen notes, genocide doesn't happen because people do nothing, but because people of all kinds, under particular circumstances, do bad things. By focusing on so-called bystanders, well-meaning educators displace the responsibility onto ordinary people who often have little room to maneuver in a situation of state-sponsored violence. Rather, the focus should be on the perpetrators and the systems and the cultures that enable them. With this perspective in mind, what I'd like to propose to you today is that the study of the past offers a form of accountability for the crimes committed. And it can also push back against the erasure of the victims that genocides engender in both history and memory. I'd like to leave a lot of time for discussion, so I've planned to talk for just about 30 minutes. And my talk has three components. First, what is genocide? The second one is about accountability, and the third part is about uncovering victims' voices. First, what are we talking about when we talk about genocide? Although the word genocide did not exist until the mid-20th century, genocides are part of human history from ancient times to the present. Recent developments in technology and state power have made these events more destructive and better documented, but genocides are universal in time and place. Some scholars specialize in a specific genocide, other works comparatively. I think it's particularly fruitful to work comparatively with the students in the classroom because it allows them to discuss similarities and differences in behavior, trace connections between different genocides and between genocides and other forms of mass violence. In fact, the 1948 United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, a document that defines genocide as an international crime and commits its signatories to the prevention of genocide and punishment of the perpetrators of the crime, that convention was itself a result of such comparative observations. Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer who coined the term genocide, began his work after learning about the 1915 Ottoman genocide against Armenians. And there are a couple of aspects of the concept that are especially important. First, the 1948 definition of genocide is still the most widely accepted one, and scholars have suggested other ones, but the convention is the one that sort of stands, and it reads, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Acts include killing members of the group, B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Thus, in times of war and peace, genocide is defined by acts intended to destroy in whole or in part a group of people defined according to specific criteria for membership in that group. It refers to acts inflicting both physical and psychological conditions that are calculated to destroy the group. Genocides are therefore more than mass killings. Acts committed with intent to destroy include rape and other forms of sexual violence, forced assimilation programs, and displacement intended to destroy the group. Second point about genocide. While genocides are part of human history, the modern period is the focus of much scholarship. Modern genocides are state-sponsored, and they often happen in the context of civil conflict, civil wars, or as part of wars of conquest. Some unfold as one event. For example, the Armenian genocide 1915 to 16 over a short period of time, same for Rwanda in 1994. Other genocides are more like a series of genocidal massacres that stretch across many decades, such as the so-called American Indian Wars. In my class, as we study a series of case studies of genocide, several things surprise students. One, genocides involve not only mass violence, but also mass participation. Second, the extent to which social and material incentives underpin perpetrators' planning and execution of genocide. And the third surprise is the sheer depth of the destruction that genocides cause. Towards the end of the semester, when we get to the section of my class entitled Justice ? Students and I are stunned by the ongoing lack of accountability in the past as well as in the present for perpetrators and enablers of genocide. And this brings me to the second part of my presentation, namely accountability. The Genocide Convention seems to hold out some promise of justice and accountability. Remember, it was the commitment to both prevent and to prosecute the perpetrators. Yet the nature of genocides makes exactly that impossible, in part due to the large number of people participating in the crime. In Rwanda, for example, approximately 120,000 accused perpetrators were held in the country's prison from 1994 to 2003. It would take more than 200 years to bring them all to trial in international court. While a system of community tribunals was created, the overwhelmed prison authorities ended up releasing tens of thousands of accused perpetrators to go home. Many think that the post-World War II Nuremberg trials were about genocide. They were not. There were separate trials that dealt with various aspects of what we've come to understand as part of the Nazi genocide, but the number of defendants was minuscule. Indeed, the perpetrators and enablers of Nazi Germany's genocidal projects targeting people with disabilities, Jews and Romani, and Soviet prisoners of wars were never identified, indicted, or spent any meaningful time in prison. The recent flurry of trials of very elderly men in Germany is, most people agree, too little, too late. What I'd like to suggest is that historical scholarship can serve as a form for accountability. The careful examination of historical evidence, ranging from official and secret documents to witness testimonies and forensic evidence, allow us to lay bare, without having to prove legal guilt or innocence, who planned, who decided, who acted, who enabled, and why. If genocides happen because people do bad things, then history can show us who they were and why they did it. I asked students in my Holocaust class why they think people participated in the persecution and murder of the victims. Most students' answers are some version of they had to follow orders, they feared for their lives, or they hated Jews, or even more problematic, the passive voice, they were made to hate Jews. What is astonishing are two things. First, that these 2021 answers are the same as the ones produced right after World War II. And second, they reflect what ordinary people themselves claimed when explaining their actions during the Nazi period. What has sustained the validity of these answers? It is in part a persistent image of Nazi Germany as a society in which the state terrorized everyone into compliance, a society unlike our own. What historians have shown, however, is that Nazi Germany relied not only on coercion, but also on the consent and even the enthusiastic participation of thousands of Germans and other Europeans. In general terms, this means that in pursuit of their priorities, Nazi authorities developed both coercive tactics as well as strategies that allowed people to participate and benefit from Nazi policies. In fact, it seems that people did bad things because there were significant social, material, and for some ideological incentives to do so. the foot soldiers of genocide, the thousands of ordinary men and fewer women who served as police officers, guards, nurses, doctors, and as we're increasingly learning, the ordinary people in occupied territory who participated in and benefited from mass murder. These people came from all walks of life, and their motivations were often familiar and mundane. Moreover, not only Germans, but many other Europeans were directly involved. Let me give you a few examples. More than 20 years ago, the historian Christopher Browning published a study of a German reserve police battalion stationed in ghettos and small towns in German-occupied Poland. The reserve policemen were part of the manpower used to murder and round up Jews in the East. It is estimated that these units killed upward of 2 million people, mainly by shooting men, women, and children at close range. In Ordinary Men, as the book was called, Browning showed how these policemen killed despite being allowed to opt out of the killing by their commanding officer. Before long, the men of Police Battalion 101 became experienced and willing killers. Browning argues that they did so, not because of life-threatening coercion, but because of the social pressure from the other men in the unit. They did not want to be seen as cowards. The few men who refused to kill, who did not conform, were simply assigned other non-shooting duties. Recently, the historian Edward Westerman has shown that among these foot soldiers of genocide, gender-based norms and practices contributed to a culture that used alcohol to facilitate and celebrate killing and sexual violence. Much like perpetrators in the German East, Hutu villagers and townspeople in Rwanda in 1994 engaged in genocidal violence as a matter of routine. Killing was an opportunity for social recognition by their peers, and the killers celebrated their work before, during, and after the killings. As it turns out, in certain circumstances, ordinary people kill as a matter of routine and are often driven by social incentives rather than coercion. Thanks to the study of the past and the work of historians, not the courts, these perpetrators will be remembered for what most of them were, namely willing and some enthusiastic killers. When it comes to the role of ordinary people who were not agents of the state, so what one might refer to as neighbors, historians working on genocides separated by time and space have brought to light remarkable silenced and suppressed stories. The genocide in Rwanda in 1994 lasted for about 100 days, during which almost 800,000 Tutsis and some Hutus were murdered by militias and a large number of civilians. In villages across Rwanda, Hutus hunted down and killed their Tutsi neighbors. Killers and their victims knew each other by name. Sometimes members of the same family included victims and perpetrators. The daily killings were followed by looting and feasting. The killers and their families had first dips at the spoils. One man claimed that when he hesitated to join the daily hunt, as the killings were referred to, his wife pressured him as she wanted access to Tutsi property, and that was granted first and foremost to the killers. Flashback to July 1941 in the eastern Polish town of Jedwabne. At the end of the day on July 10th, local townsfolk and villagers were dividing the property of the town's Jews, and about half of Jedwabne's population had been Jewish. That day in July, almost all of the Jews had been murdered by their Polish neighbors, some of whom had initiated and planned the murder. The Jews were hunted down, beaten to death, and burned alive in a barn. Since 2000, when Jan Gross's book Neighbors brought this event to light, researchers have uncovered evidence of much wider local participation in the plunder and murder of Jews in German-occupied territory. In Poland, as in Rwanda, ordinary men and women who knew their victims, often by name, became killers and plunderers when the opportunity presented itself. While there have been attempts in both post-war Poland and post-genocide Rwanda to bring killers to trial, the extent of neighbors' participation makes this difficult. For various reasons, these histories have been suppressed. Today, scholars uncovering the crimes have provided some measure of accountability by documenting who planned it, who acted, and who benefited. Accountability not in the form of punishment, but in the form of knowledge. Now we know. Let me turn to the last part of my presentation, which I've called Uncovering Victims' Voices. The second aspect of studying and teaching genocides that I believe is significant and meaningful is to read and listen to victims' voices and perspectives. At its core, genocide is about erasure, about killing, destroying, and forgetting. Once people are dead or displaced, the memory of their presence and of the crimes committed fade. Victims are silenced by death and by trauma, but victims are also erased by the fact that we often learn about genocide through the words and images created by the perpetrators. And often these materials are used in ways that do not alert the viewers or the readers to the gaze they assume. The materials, so photographs, film, reports, plundered objects, private correspondence, this material all become objective historical documentation. Images of victims staged and captured by perpetrators in the American West or in the Warsaw Ghetto are not neutral imprints of the past. The images reproduce the gaze of the perpetrator, and the content has to be approached thoughtfully. Perpetrator documentation has to be approached with great care, yet for some victim groups, the documents left behind by the perpetrators are the only way for us to uncover the victims. Let me give you an example of this conundrum. The first group targeted by Nazi authorities in a program of mass murder were people with disabilities. People who lived in institutions due to mental health disorders or physical and intellectual disabilities were especially at risk. Political and medical authorities defined people with disabilities as, quote, useless eaters. Their policy caused rapidly deteriorating living conditions in most institutions for adults and children in Germany. Close to 500,000 Germans were sterilized, and at least 200,000 adults and children were murdered as part of this killing program. These victims are among the ones most profoundly erased. This is in part due to their isolation, their marginalization, and their specific conditions. We know about these victims from medical records, from their relatives, sometimes from their artwork and letters. What is notable is the absence of victims' voices when it comes to the murder of people with disabilities. At times, well-meaning documentary filmmakers, for example, try to bring the fate of these victims to light by using the German films shot in the institutions where many of the victims lived. These films were produced to dehumanize people with disability. And I want to draw your attention to the image in the left-hand corner of the screen. As you can see, camera angles and lighting are used deliberately to create a visual narrative that dehumanizes the men and women forced in front of them. These films and images are not documentation. They are a violation of the victims. In seeking to bring these stories to light, does one perpetuate dehumanization? Let me give you an example of the way in which perpetrators' documentation can be challenged by victim and survivor testimony when this exists. Here are two photographs from the same series of pictures taken by a German photographer on May 23, 1944 in Auschwitz-Birkenau. These images, a whole series of them, are collected in an album known now as the Auschwitz Album. And I will mention that they were collected by someone before it was found. So it was titled and collected by perpetrators. These photographs are used by countless of documentaries and history books, and you might even have seen them. Countless filmmakers and publishers use these as documentation of the death camps, as an objective reality. We don't know what the photographer planned to do with the images, but we do know that they were meant to document the process of destruction, from arrival of the victims to induction into the camp slave labor force, or them assembled in the birch tree groves that we now know were just outside the gas chambers and crematoria in Birkenau. In these images, the photographer's angle, standing as he does on top of the train's roof, that angle creates a narrative in which German order transforms the masses of indistinguishable beings on the arrival platform into orderly rows of men and women. With the imposition of German order, they are ready to enter the next stage of selection, where German officials divide people into useful and useless human material. The victims appear overwhelmed by German order and efficiency, obediently following the orders of the uniformed guards. An image that to most viewers confirmed the dismissive stereotype of the victims as going, quote, like sheep to the slaughter. However, by listening to survivor testimonies from Birkenau, we can begin to undo the story told by the perpetrators and reproduced when these images are used without the inclusion of other evidence. Survivors describe arriving in Birkenau in horrifically overcrowded train cars, having endured days of travel in the heat of the summer or the bitter cold of winter, with little or no food or water. The trains were full of dead people, and the survivors were desperate for the doors to open. When they did, it was complete chaos, with guards yelling and beating the arrivals viciously. Guards hit and murdered arrivals as they separated families in order to sort people into rows of men and women. The omnipresent, disorienting, and deadly violence is notably absent in these images. If we look closely, we catch a glimpse of the guards' sticks and rifles, but the images alone convey order, obedience, and efficiency. As I mentioned earlier, perpetrators often seek to erase the memory of victims, and they do so in acts other than killing. Rituals of humiliation and the tortures inflicted by the perpetrators on victims are practices meant to destroy the cohesion of families and communities and to silence through shame and terror. Sexual violence staged to implicate relatives or community members are examples of such rituals. In a testimony published as Dovi's Story, a woman who survived the Armenian genocide in 1915 recounts the following. When the genocide began, Ottoman soldiers murdered her father and strung his mutilated and beheaded body up on the door of the family's home. After about a week, Dovi ventured into town. At the marketplace, she heard and saw a crowd, and she approached, carefully making sure to blend in. Here's what she saw. Half a dozen Turkish soldiers were entertaining themselves by forcing a group of Armenian women to dance in a circle. Local townspeople watched casually as the soldiers whipped the women, ripping the clothes. When the soldiers doused the women in kerosene and set their hair on fire, they forced a group of Armenian children, some of them the children of the women, to clap their hands, faster, 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 as if to create a rhythm to which the dying women would dance. As Dovi noted, the townspeople clapped along too. Perpetrators seek to silence and erase victims by inflicting terror and shame. Let me close my remarks with this example. one that speaks to another aspect of why I believe it's imperative to recover victims' voices. Last fall, the students and I read a series of survivor testimonies from Rwanda. The stories were collected by the French journalist Jean Hartsfeld in 2000 and published in a book called Life Laid Bare. On the cover, you could see it here. In the book, we hear from men and women, young and older, schoolboys and teachers, farmers, tavern keepers, people from all walks of life. Survivors recount their experiences during the genocide and what their lives have been since then. What stood out to us was how alone they felt. Most were the only survivors of their families. Even as they built new families by taking in orphans, finding new spouses, they relived their experiences in constant conversation with other survivors. Aspects of their life read like ongoing acts through which they try to endure survival. One boy, who was then 12 years old, Cassius Nyonsaba, and he's here, pictured here on the cover of the book. Cassius was the only survivor of his family, and he dreamed of becoming a teacher like his father. Cassius says, quote, "I no longer remember how many big and little brothers and sisters I had, because my memory is too taken up by so many deaths. It's not handy with numbers anymore. That slows me down in school too. But I can relive in full transparency the massacres in the church and the ferociousness of the Hutu killers." Cassius made a point of going to the church every day on his way to school, and as he points out, Saturdays and Sundays too. He would spend time in the churchyard. And again, he reflects, "At the beginning, I felt inclined to cry, seeing those skulls without names or eyes looking at me, but little by little, you get used to it. I sit there for a long time and my thoughts go off with all of them. I simply travel in memory among all those dead who were scattered around and didn't get buried." Cassius's life revolves around the presence of absence, of family and of friends. Survivor stories were never meant to be heard. Our obligation is to look at the devastation wrought by genocide, confront the experiences of the victims and the pain of the survivors, and not look away. As a professor and historian of genocide, my intention is to expose students to a serious engagement with the past, rather than to look for a set of clearly defined and often simplistic lessons of history. The study of this history can serve as a form of accountability and a way to push back against perpetrators' intention to erase the victims. Without a doubt, this is going to make us more informed about our capacities as humans. One can only hope that it'll make us more mature and empathetic human observers, and thus people better equipped to meet the challenges of today and inevitably those of future generations. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Lichtenstein. This is Patricia Shampton with Texas Exes. We really appreciate you talking with us today. We do have a couple of questions coming in. The first one is really more of an observation, but I would love your thoughts on this. So Greg Lixcomb says, "It sounds like teaching about the Holocaust through the decades has changed dramatically, and an effort to keep up with the evidence and the analysis." And I kind of agree with that. You research is really focused on the victims and the victims' experience and trying to make sure that those stories are told. As I remember when I was in school, we either did not learn about that or that information was not available. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that's very true, that both the research and the teaching of this has changed dramatically. From the very outset after World War II, there was a real victims and survivor testimonies. Survivor appeared at the trials, but they were really not considered to be credible evidence. It was really the perpetrator documentation that that was used as evidence, and it was also that became the basis for some of the writing about the Holocaust. But and till about the 1960s, with the Eichmann trial in Israel, which was televised and radio broadcast around the world, it was really not until the 1960s that victims gradually began to get more of a voice, if you will, in our understanding of the Holocaust. And I think, again, I think any credible historian of these events now really bring in many different perspectives precisely to avoid reproducing stories and narratives that perpetrators were keen and invested to reproduce. So as I showed here, when looking at official documentation, people try and bring in other perspectives. And it's not necessarily just victims or survivors, but other perspectives, like other witnesses, for instance. But definitely, as the research and the teaching at the university level, victims are a key part of it, and students read those narratives now as well. I will say, though, that it has also I think it's had some unfortunate results as well. There's been such a shift away from perpetrators and really a focus on what people call bystanders, because of all this sort of popular Holocaust, popular civic education using the Holocaust and genocide. And sometimes that includes also focusing too much on victims' perspectives, that we lose track of why these perpetrators did what they did at all different levels, right? Why people exclude, why people inflict violence, why people shame. We've lost a little bit of perspective of that, and that was the point I was trying to make in the lecture, that genocides don't happen because victims are passive or bystanders don't do anything. Genocides happen because people do bad things. And I think that has to be where we are really focusing in terms of trying to understand how the events unfold, why people participate, and so on. But their motivations are very much illuminated by bringing in victims' experiences and survivor testimonies, perspectives on these events. Did that answer your question?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
It kind of brings up a question that's related to the last part of your answer. And this question is, if the killings are motivated by economic gain, which you did talk about a little bit, such as property, is it still considered genocide? And I would love to get your perspective on that. So if it really was a specific reason that the perpetrators, did these horrible things, is it genocide or is it personal? So.
Well, I think, I don't think you can draw such distinct kind of lines, because the genocide is in essence a state-sponsored event, right? Like they are the planning, the intent, the will to carry through, whether you're looking in Rwanda or whether you're looking in Nazi Germany, in the American West, it is fueled by the resources of the state. That's the first point. Why people become involved, that doesn't really define genocide. That makes us understand how these events become so massive and why they become so devastating as well. But the initial, the events themselves are not, genocide is not started by one villager, right? Or one village that decides to do something. It is almost always a state-sponsored event that then creates opportunities, avenues for people to participate and to gain from it.
And we have a couple of questions.
Like intent to destroy in whole or in part can certainly be motivated by economics as well.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be motivated by a racial idea, for instance. As you know, it's very much just they often go hand in hand, but if you look at the American West, for instance, land is the issue, right? Yeah. Territory.
Yeah. And I think that's what this viewer was getting at in his question. Mm-hmm. There's a couple of questions here in general about combating Holocaust denial. In the view of continued anti-Semitism in Europe as well as in the US. Do you have some additional comments on how to combat that, or how to bring that conversation forth and have more meaningful conversations about that particular subject and why people think that it didn't happen?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. This question often comes up, the question of Holocaust denial. And I'm probably going to give a little bit of possibly an unsatisfying answer to some people. You know, we cannot police and control what people say. What we can do is educate ourselves, and as a teacher, try to teach others skills and practice skills with them about how to read statements and you know, manifestos and writings, also historical writings. There are Holocaust deniers who are historians who have published books. How to read these materials critically, how to think for yourself, how to know how to investigate evidence, how people should be using evidence when the evidence doesn't hold up. Teach people to ask questions, I think, is key. Because we cannot police, it's impossible to police what people say and think. And Holocaust denial is not driven by, at the core, by a true belief in the fact that a fact of this event not happening. Holocaust denial is always driven by political movements. It's always driven, or it has been for the most part, driven by basically a white nationalist agenda, going back, right, to the perpetrators, Nazi perpetrators who, you know, were very much part of this movement after the war. It is a political movement. I don't think we can police it again. And frankly, I don't spend any time on this in my classroom at all. I don't know why I should. It is not valid historical research. Again, there are many other terrible narratives out there. I really don't think we should give them the attention that they are so craving.
There's a couple questions here related to what are some modern genocidal, or not necessarily genocides, but some modern challenges that we have where we know that certain groups of people are being treated horribly, and can you draw any correlations to what's happening in current setting in the 2000s as to Rwanda or World War II, or even farther back than that?
Yeah, I think maybe two things that I want to say to that. First of all, I think it's really important not to say, oh, if it's not genocide, then we don't need to care about it. Mm-hmm. Mass violence, right? Violations of human rights happen every day around us. And there's calling it genocide, you know, it's not a kind of a hierarchy of victimization here. People suffer. So I think it's dangerous to kind of latch onto this idea of genocide, that, oh, it was a genocide, therefore we must pay attention to it, but not to other things. I think it's really important, because that is a way of also very comfortably silencing other stories, silencing other problems, right? And being able to just look away because it's not that thing, right? It doesn't get that label. We certainly saw that politically in Rwanda, right? But people did not want to call it a genocide, because what does that mean? It means that they have ratified a convention where they have a commitment to preventing the genocide and to also punish the perpetrators. But no one wanted to go in and prevent it. So the genocide just happened. Everybody saw it happen. Probably many of you remember, we all saw it happen on TV, right? So I think this kind of obsession, too much attachment to the term is problematic in some ways, because we marginalize other forms and experiences of human suffering that are happening. The second thing I will say is that it's very instructive when we're teaching, when I teach the Holocaust in my classroom, students are often sort of, why didn't America do something, right? Like, why didn't somebody do something? And I ask students a very simple question. For instance, last fall or the other falls, we have an ongoing war in Syria, civil war, right? With terrible, terrible targeting of civilian populations, direct targeting of civilian populations. How many people in that classroom had done anything or even thought about Syria today? No, they had not, because they have other priorities. And so I think that is useful because in our lives, we have other priorities. So we cannot rely on people to pay attention to a genocide or a public kind of opinion, because it just fades, right? For prevention, we need something else. I don't know what that is, but I think we are so overwhelmed with information about all kinds of things, what happens in an Indian village, right? And what happens in Syria and what happens in a town in Louisiana all the time, that we actually kind of tune it out. And I think people in the past, certainly during World War II with mass media, were really no different. People have their own concern in their everyday life. And again, this is also why this idea of bystanders, I think it's a false narrative that, you know, somehow awareness will prevent it. Not, of course, to denigrate at all a sense of civic responsibility, right, and empathy and social solidarity, but it is just, these are complicated events, and I think it's very tricky to draw conclusions and lessons from these historical events. Yeah.
Okay. This is not really related, but we're just going to try to move on a little bit. We've talked about critical thought, but you know, there's a couple of questions in here about how do you respond when you're in a conversation and someone says, you know, the Holocaust didn't happen, or they make correlations between modern things that are clearly not the same as what's happened in the past. I mean, how do you, as a human, deal with that? Do you have any pointers on how to have those difficult conversations?
Well, you know, so the first point about what do I do if someone ever, you know, denies the Holocaust in front of me or something like that, if I understood the question like that, I can tell you that has never happened to me. I know this is really a concern for a lot of different organizations, and I just don't share the concern, and that's just based on my own experience, right? We cannot police what everybody thinks. We shouldn't. And I have never in my classroom, anywhere, had that experience. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing about drawing parallels, this is what studying, academic study is about, right? Really examining things carefully, really asking, why are you using this analogy, right? Why are you comparing these two, calling one, like often using the term genocide or Holocaust, just throwing it around, right? Or this is just like 1933 or something like that. There might very well be parallels, but history doesn't repeat itself. So I think, again, the key that we need to do in the classroom is to teach people how to read critically, how to discuss evidence, right? How to really sort of try and look at issues from different perspectives. And also to be able to identify what are people's agendas. What are their, so students often call this biases. We all have biases. I came in here with an agenda, right? But I have some authority because I'm an academically trained historian. But everybody has an agenda, and they should have, right? We work towards things we think are right, for instance. But our audience members need to continuously ask questions and continuously re-examine their own positions and be willing to be open to other perspectives. That's how you learn and how you can see whether something is just like that or is not like that. And if it is like that, then what, right? Or if it's not, then what? Like, again, I think this critical thinking, the wanting to engage with things that also sound difficult, or I can't understand that, or even like, I don't even know that I can't see what this is, you know, what this is for. Like, just be open to investigating and learning new things and investigating these perspectives.
We have one question in here that is I've heard in conversations in the past is, do you feel like the template that Germany has put into place to kind of recognize their responsibility could be used in other countries? Do you think that's a good template for recognizing and owning responsibility?
Well, that's a tricky question, because if the template is too little too late in terms of any kind of accountability of the people who are actually alive and able to make decisions, right? Maybe not, right? Having people active in the Nazi Party, active perpetrators and participants in genocide. Just look at the medical profession in Germany after World War II and Austria. All of these people went on to brilliant careers, aside from a couple of other people, continued on as doctors and nurses and so on. So no, that is definitely not a model. I think there should be some attempt at reckoning, even though it's problematic, as I showed in my talk, right? Because the sort of the spheres of complicity are very wide, right? So many people are implicated in one way or the other in these kinds of events. Now, what I do think is very admirable and a model is education in school, wanting to face your country's dark past. We're dealing with that right now in the United States. I think that is really important. And in that exercise is where you're learning to ask questions, to go beyond your own particular horizon and really try and see things from different new perspectives, right? So that commitment to wanting to really face your own dark past, however that has changed over the years in German education as well. That's one thing. The second thing I think is really important is a state-sponsored commitment to commemoration, to opening and giving public space to memorials and monuments that commemorate the bad things that this country did, right, and the people in it. Taking on that historical responsibility, right, not saying you are guilty like your grandfather or grandmother, whatever, but saying you are a human and you have the capacity for all these spectrum of behaviors. So that memorial should remind you of that. At the same time, it's also really important when you have these memorials that it allows for victims and survivors to articulate their trauma. A community like the Roma in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe have not and are still not recognized in many, many places as victims of genocide in the kind of popular discourse. It is hugely stifling, and it sort of reinforces the trauma that there's no recognition for the incredible suffering that people have experienced over generations. So I think that those are things that are very important about the German sort of recognition of a carrying of responsibility at this point.
That was an amazing answer, and we only have time for maybe one more. So we had a lot of great questions, but I am going to ask this one. What do you think about President Biden recognizing the genocide by the Ottoman Empire?
It's about time. Again, like this is such a political project for Turkey, and there's no doubt in the historical scholarship. And again, wanting to cover up these kind of mass atrocities, it is politically motivated, right? It is the evidence is there, the scholarship has been done, survivor testimonies has been collected, it's been studied very carefully. It's politically motivated, much like Holocaust denial. What can we do about it? Well, we can't police, right? But we can certainly keep ourselves informed and be, again, critical and aware of what kind of agenda, what reasons people have to talk about things one way or the other. I think the key, again, is Devote yourself to study and learning. And, you know, this for all of us, it's a lifelong kind of endeavor, right? And it's just really opens your horizon and gives you so many fresh perspectives if you just keep reading and keep kind of wanting to engage with difficult questions.
Okay, so what my takeaway is always ask the difficult questions and have an open mind. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I do have one question from a viewer that's pretty specific. She is doing research on her father and mother who were victims in Poland and Soviet Union. And she's written to the, I'm not saying this correctly, Arlson Archives International Center on Nazi persecution, but she needs to dig deeper. Are there some resources or something that you can point her to help her out?
What kind of victims were they from Soviet Union and like?
She doesn't say. She just says World War II.
She didn't say. Okay, so the research institute she's referring to is the ITS Archive, the International Tracing Service. And actually, I would go through the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum because they're very actively engaged in that archive. It's an archive that basically has data collected after the war by Red Cross for families to trace their relatives. And the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. has a wonderful website, which I encourage everyone to go on to. And there's information about all kinds of genocides, but they're very focused also on family research and that kind of history. And they are very involved with the ITS archive.
Beautiful. Well, again, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
We really, really appreciate talking with you. And it's just amazing to hear another perspective on the significance of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies. We're really just appreciative of you taking the time to join us. And,
thank you so much for being here and for your questions too.
Oh, sure. It's my pleasure. I love this. We also want to thank everyone that was on the call today and who's participated. We love being able to connect with you virtually, and we love to hear from the university's top professors. And our next lunchtime lecture is in May, and it's scheduled for Tuesday, May 25th, with Dr. Eric Tane from the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies. You can learn more and register at texasexes.org/lunchtime lectures. Again, thank you for everyone who attended. It was a great talk, and y'all have a wonderful week.